Appalachian Harvest is a food hub located in Southwest Virginia that provides regional herb and vegetable farmers with training, technical support, aggregation, and distribution services, connecting them to retail markets. We currently source produce from farmers in Virginia, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, and North Carolina. This webinar is made possible by Risk Management Agency 2018 Risk Management Education Partnership Program.
And as I mentioned, for this series, what we wanted to do is really, one, look at introducing new concepts related to horticulture production specifically, as well as risk management on the farm. And so, a lot of times we didn't dwell on using the word risk management, but when we were talking about diseases or insects, or talking about pre-planning decisions, looking at budgets even, all of that comes together under the umbrella of risk management. So we hope that you gained something from that. And the other key we wanted to focus on was new sources of specifically reliable information and other resources for our producers. As we go throughout tonight, I'll probably talk some more about reliable information sources because the reality is in the internet connected age that we are in, there's any number of different resources available to producers. Most of us have a smartphone in our pocket that allows us to literally reach around the world, and that brings all sorts of information to us. The difficulty, of course, is that information quality information? Does it apply to our region? And that sometimes, especially for novice growers, I think is a challenge. So what we want to do with this series is present to folks, whether experienced or novice, excellent resources that we know to be unbiased, so they're not self-supporting of their own products, and also the result of research-backed trials. So again, it's not just conjecture. It's not that someone grew something for 1 year and they've made this determination. And so to that end, let's go ahead and start looking at some of the regional service providers. You'll note as we go through this, some of these we've already presented to you in one way or another, but we'll get a little more specific this evening. Cooperative Extension Service. So you've heard me probably mention several times throughout the webinar series, if you've been part of it, the Extension Service. The Cooperative Extension Service is actually relatively new, depending on how you want to look at things, in as much it's only a little over 100 years old. It dates back to 1914 when it was created by the Smith-Lever Act. And what the Smith-Lever Act did was actually follow up on prior legislation that occurred at a federal level. This was a federal act that created land-grant universities. You may have heard that phrase associated with cooperative extension efforts. And the land-grant universities were basically tasked with doing research on other topics, including agriculture specifically. But the difficulty arose that you have these institutions doing research, but it wasn't getting to the individuals that it could best benefit. So it wasn't that the average farmer was going to the university for education, and so there was kind of a gap between research that was being funded even at those universities and it actually being put to practical use. And so the Smith-Lever Act attempted to resolve that. And what it did, it created what we now know as the Cooperative Extension Service. And it was a way to actually take that research-based knowledge out to the communities, specifically, especially in those days, the more rural communities, and strengthen them in any number of different aspects. There was quite a bit of production information, obviously, and that's still true to its heritage, but even back then, there was the well-being of families. So the family consumer sciences, or home economics, as it might have been known, was a large focus as well. So it wasn't just the field, it wasn't just the animals. It was the entire well-being of the rural economy, and as well as the environment. Because we have to realize, in 1914, you're looking at, 15 to 20 years before the things such as the Dust Bowl era. So the cooperative extension very soon found itself being a very necessary tool in combating environmental issues in rural communities as well as those as urban. And so what we find today, and this is pretty much the case across the U.S., more or less, there's differences in every state, But basically you'll find local offices that are available to assist producers. And so in Kentucky, you can see the website there on your screen, as well as their logo. And it's easy enough. You don't have to worry about copying down the website. If you just Google Cooperative Extension in Kentucky or anything even close to that, you can find this website pretty easily. Kentucky still maintains a county office in every county, as well as Virginia. Some states that is different, but both of these states still have a rather robust presence. And we always tell people it's good to start at your county office because there is also a number of online resources. And in fact, there's a nationally based outreach mechanism called e-extension that has numerous webinars, videos, as well as articles that are of great use to producers. But the reason I want you to start at your county office is one, it gives you local knowledge. So if there's a field day locally or regionally happening, you're going to find out through the local office. Most local offices maintain some sort of newsletter or even just following the office on any of the social media channels will keep you up to date on those sorts of things that are happening at a local level. Also, it gives you that, real-time information about what's happening in your community. So, it's well and good to know that there's a freeze event happening or the other end of the state or happening in a different state or things like that. Whenever we see these unusual occurrences, it makes the national TV sometimes if there's not a lot else going on. But what's really happening locally? And so having that connection to a local office that's geared towards that is a true benefit to the grower. And the other thing is that there's actually the ability for the individual agent, as they're referred to in the county offices, to actually come out and visit your farm. Help you do a walkthrough and consider what's happening with your farm. And so I like the fact that the county office is still available in these two states particularly. Some states have seen a dramatic shrinkage of that to where there's more regional-based offices, and that sometimes means less time to work directly with farmers. So I'd encourage you to track down your local extension office if you're not already familiar with it. And one thing I will stress is at the county level, no one agent is going to be an expert on everything. And so you will run into offices that might not have a lot of information or expertise in regards to horticulture. They may be on more traditional agricultural enterprises for the areas like livestock or maybe row cropping, just depending where you're at across the state. I'd still encourage you to start that conversation with the extension office, because one of the great things about having that local person is they have the ability to reach out to specialists at a state or regional level for backup. So you may ultimately be working with a specialist or a regional agent that covers multiple counties who is a specialist in horticulture or some other aspect. So simply because your individual office may not have expertise in-house in what you're looking at is still not a good reason to write them off, because they have the ability to introduce you to those other individuals who can assist you. So I always encourage you to start with your local office. I will caution though, your extension service is not going to tell you what to do on your farm. I actually began my professional career as an extension agent, and occasionally we'd get the phone call or the visit by someone who came in and say, I have a 100-acre farm now, what am I supposed to do? The one thing that I don't think any agent would ever attempt to do is tell you what to do with your farm. And sometimes that can be challenging to folks that aren't sure what they want to do. But what's great is they can point you to possibilities. So there's any number of different publications or other resources that they'll be able to point you to that can help you understand some positives, some negatives. Obviously, they can steer away from something that simply does not work for the region. Sometimes there may be a new plant or a new something that's just all the rage somewhere, but because we have a really cold winter, it just simply won't survive or something like that. Obviously, they can help you steer away from a pothole like that. But, allow them to put resources in your hand that's going to let you help make effective decisions. But don't expect them to answer, what am I going to grow on my farm? Because that's only a question that you as an individual can answer for your farm. These are two very common resources that we have referenced throughout this series of webinars. These are the commercial production recommendations for vegetable growers. I think anything that had to do with production and vegetables, which is most of these webinars, except maybe crop insurance or something like that, we have these on the screen at some time. So you'll see the one for Mid-Atlantic, which includes Virginia, and then the one for Kentucky. Both of these are great. I encourage you, if you're looking at production for more than just your own personal consumption, that you take a look at these, because they'll help you have solutions to problems and different disorders that you may have on your farm. So obviously, to me, these go to the top of the list when it's, what sort of resources are available to us. And again, these are available to us through the Cooperative Extension Network, and there are researchers that make these things possible. Similarly, you may remember this one from when we were looking at kind of our series on diseases as well as insects. These IPM manuals from University of Kentucky, I think, are top-notch. Really good resource to be familiar with. They apply very well to Virginia as well, and really the whole region. But I think Kentucky did a very good job in putting these manuals together. I can't recommend them highly enough to you. So that's kind of a snapshot of cooperative extension. It's hard to kind of summarize in a short period everything that cooperative extension does, because a lot of you are familiar with 4-H and things like that work with youth, as well as their efforts in family consumer sciences, and so on and so on. But for our purposes, I hope that gave you a better snapshot on why it might be a good idea to start with local extension offices and see what they can offer to you. Next, I want to talk about the USDA service centers. And we're actually going to talk about a couple of different components within that umbrella, and we'll start with the Farm Service Agency. So the Farm Service Agency, or FSA office, as a lot of folks will refer to it, the one thing that pops up, and you'll see online and elsewhere, is get a farm number. So if you're familiar with some of your federal cost share programs and things of that nature, they may ask for your farm number, and you actually secure that through your Farm Service Agency. I would recommend that you reach out to your local office, and we'll show this in a little more detail, but there on your screen right now is the website and a snapshot of it. And actually, you just click on your state. Now, I will mention that both Virginia and Kentucky are actually divided on your clickable link online. So make sure you're clicking on the correct end of the state for where you live. If you click on it and it's the wrong half of the state, just hit the back button. You can bring up the correct one. But they do have those split apart, so be aware of that. And what's good about getting that farm number is it does make you eligible for a number of different programs, not only on the federal level. We also see some carryover to state and more locally based programs that also utilize the farm number. What's good about it is it doesn't have to be a farm of any specific size. What makes a farm a farm for the farm number purposes is basically its use. So if you've got 1.5 acres and you're pulling things off of it as a farm, you're trying to have a business from that, even though it may only be 1.5 acres or something like that, or maybe even smaller, doesn't matter. You don't have to have 100 acres. It's all about how are you utilizing that land and whether or not it would qualify to receive a farm number. And so one of the things that they'll do is start as part of this process is they'll outline what fields you have, what crops you're producing in those fields. And what's good about that is there's actually mechanisms where you can come back and report sales figures. And the reason that's good is because one of the things that this office does is it interacts with you in regards to crop insurance. And so while there are federal numbers associated with the value of crops, typically speaking, especially for things like vegetables, when you look at what smaller producers or even some of our wholesale size producers get locally within this region for their crops, the federal number is significantly lower. And so if you're able to establish cropping history and pricing history with them, in the event you have insurance and you have a covered loss, they can actually utilize your numbers and your records to demonstrate what the payout numbers would be, rather than utilizing the numbers that are at the national level. So there is a benefit to supplying information back to the FSA office and going through that process with them. So I'd encourage you to do that. The other functions that the FSA office has beyond just insurance is farm loans, particularly when you're looking at beginning farmers or things of that nature where there isn't an established history necessarily that would allow a lot of lenders to want to participate with you as a source of lending. So there's a number of different programs. Some of those are listed on the screen of farm loans that are available. The other thing is when there's disasters associated with loss of agricultural crops or livestock, or sometimes they'll talk about indemnity. Whenever there's these emergency things that happen, such as the flooding that has happened out in the Midwest just recently, there are programs specifically for those instances and for the losses that producers suffer, and those programs are ran through the FSA office. So having that relationship, beginning with an identity with them through your farm number, I think is something important for producers to begin with. And it also is the sort of gateway into walking into other available things. Whenever you click on your state on that previous website, and you go to actually the county, there'll be a county you can click on. What you'll see is something like this that pops up. And I just use Scott County, Virginia for where we're located at currently. And what you'll notice is it gives us two different options here. The top one, the Gate City Service Center, not surprisingly, is in Gate City. And you'll see listed down there in blue, the Farm Service Agency, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, as well as Conservation District. And then that second box actually shows the Rural Development Area Office. Ordinarily, I would say your average farmer isn't going to interact with the Rural Development Office on a regular basis. They do a lot more higher level regional economic development things rather than just working with individual farmers. So as a rule, just pay attention to if there's more than one location listed. In this case, Farm Service Agency, Natural Resources Conservation Service, and Conservation District are all in the same location. That is not always the case. I have seen online where people will say that, your FSA office is typically with your Cooperative Extension office. That is not at all the case. Oftentimes, they are located in different places. Depending on the state and the region, you may actually have to travel a county or two to find your FSA office. Not every county is going to have a service center for you to visit. They are regionally located sometimes, so do be aware of that. So if you're looking up where the office is, make sure if you're not looking at a computer listing like this that details it, give them a call before you go so you make sure you're going to the right place for the services you're wanting to interact. And so since we did just mention on that slide, NRCS or Natural Resources Conservation Service, what this does is basically offer the ability, and I have a little sentence or two up there, it's voluntary programs to eligible landowners and agricultural producers to provide financial and technical assistance to help manage natural resources in a sustainable manner. So what they actually do is they have essentially given us a carrot to implement any number of best practices when it comes to our farm operations. And that carrot that I'm talking about is actually cost shares. And there's any number of different programs that are under the three umbrellas you see bulleted down there at the bottom of the screen. One that's fairly familiar, especially in the past 5 or 6 years or so, is the EQIP, or Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And the reason I say that, especially among horticulture producers, this one has become commonly utilized because they have an element that helps pay for the acquisition of high tunnels. And high tunnels are something that a lot of direct-to-consumer horticulture producers especially find valuable for their farms. But let me encourage you that if you're going to interact with the NRCS office, and this would be after you've already gone to FSA, or sometimes if they're co-located, maybe the same day, that you don't just walk in and say, I want a high tunnel. And the reason I say that is they offer a tremendous number of different programs that your farm can qualify for depending on a conservation plan. And so what I would do is I'd just introduce myself to them and let them know that you want to have a conservation plan for your farm created. And then that would allow you to enter into any number of different cost shares that you would qualify for, as opposed to just saying, I want X, and missing out on any other number of things that might assist you on your farm. And there are some differences depending on which state you're in. These programs, while nationally based, do have some variance where one state may have a program and one state may not. So if you happen to know farmers in another state, you may find out they're doing something that's not come to your state yet. That is something that, depending on feedback from producers, sometimes priorities within a state do change over time. And so programs that maybe once weren't offered will be. I know that was the case with high tunnels within Kentucky. Once upon a time, that was not part of Kentucky's EQIP program. And then ultimately it did become part of it. And part of that was there was feedback from the agricultural community that, yeah, this is a program that our producers can take advantage of. So again, start by creating a conservation plan. One thing that's good about the NRCS conservation plan is if you're looking to become certified organic and you're in a transition period, some of the plan that you can create will actually substitute for some of the record keeping that's expected of you, because you're keeping those records as part of this plan. And so it can actually limit some of the paperwork you might have to do as you enter into organic certification. So if you remember back to the webinar we did on organic certification, we talked about that a little bit further, but just a reminder on that. And as an example, so here in Virginia, under EQIP, and we're just going to skim this real quickly, but you can see the 5 programs that are under that, including the High Tunnel System Initiative. And if we click over to Kentucky, you'll note it's very similar, but not exact. So here we have one on the Mississippi River Basin, whereas if we flip back to Virginia, we see one on Longleaf Pine Initiative. So again, there are differences from state to state. So you may find one program in a state and not in another. And again, that's based on priorities at a state level for conservation. And if you think back for a moment to that slide where we did see the Gate City Service Center, there was a listing on there for conservation district. So what in the world is a conservation district? Well, in the 30s, in part due to the Dust Bowl, they created conservation districts across the U.S., specifically looking at conserving soil and water. And so that's what it's specifically referencing, and we still have those today. And so what you find is very often they are housed with the NRCS, not always, but they do work together to collaborate and to cooperatively present some programs or complement one another. Excuse me. So as I was preparing for this, I was going through, and one thing I saw in a newsletter from one conservation district in Kentucky specifically was talking about, if you tried to participate at the state level for a specific program, there were also county funds available for that program. So there are sometimes different pots of monies with a local conservation district that may also be available to you. Another thing, and you see a snapshot of it there from the Scott County Soil Conservation District, they actually have some shared use equipment. They've got a lime spreader up there on the screen. They also, specifically that office, happens to have a no-till drill. That's not unusual. It's not uncommon that your conservation districts may have shared use equipment available. Not all of them do, but it's something that does happen often enough it should be mentioned. You can see the 2 main websites there for Virginia and Kentucky. In Virginia, they're actually housed under the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. But if you remember back, they were also listed on that USDA Service Center website, so you can access them there. In Kentucky, they're part of the Energy and Environment Cabinet. But again, your local extension office or even your local FSA or NRCS office is going to be well acquainted with the Soil Conservation District or Soil and Water Conservation District, and they will be able to help point you in that direction if you're having difficulty finding them. So again, depending on which county you're in and which state you're in, you may find that they do more or less than others. It just depends on each county and how they do that. I'll mention again, we mentioned this several times throughout the webinar series, taking a look at utilizing pesticides. Again, whether conventional or organic, I think it's to the benefit of an individual to get their private applicator certification or private applicator license. These are kind of the state level contacts for both Kentucky and Virginia. Again, your local extension office is a great place to start, but you're more than welcome to reach out to the state level contacts as well. A lot of extension offices will have a training class or a testing class early in January, February, March timeframe for producers. It may not be too late. Sometimes they will have later ones for those that may have drugged their feet and missed those classes. So I still encourage you to reach out even now if it's something you're looking at doing. And again, what this private applicator process does is confirms that you can read and understand the basics of pesticide labels. And that's why it's excellent for both conventional as well as organic producers. There's organic pesticides, for instance, that have protections that should be followed for pollinators, such as honeybees. So we definitely want to make sure that we're using any product that's labeled for agriculture use in the proper manner. And I think going through this process and just having this certification in place is a good idea for producers. And I'll just remind you, if you happen to be doing GAP or Good Agricultural Practices certification for your farm, it's actually a question with points associated with it for the basic USDA GAP. So it's not a bad idea just to do that, just for that purpose. And I did want to take a moment and just mention that there are other good resources out there for producers. Some of these you may be familiar with, some of them maybe not. So there's producer organizations like Organic Association of Kentucky, or Virginia Association for Biological Farming, which are specifically oriented more towards organic producers. They both sponsor their own individual conferences. They both have field days or other learning events available for folks. So they're a great resource. And again, they're, that local base. They have a more narrow focus than maybe some of the national organizations, which I think in this case is a good thing because it helps meet the needs of folks in those states. KCARD, or the Kentucky Center for Agriculture and Rural Development, if you remember back, they're actually the entity that presented to us for both business plan development as well as crop insurance. And so their services for individuals in Kentucky is a great resource. They help with business planning. They help with securing grants or things of that nature. They have resources for that. Aaron Shapiro, I was at a event a couple of weeks ago, a local producers conference in Kentucky. Aaron Shapiro had put together a PowerPoint of a whole bunch of different financial resources. Didn't want to include them all tonight in this presentation because the majority of them are specific to Kentucky. But if you reach out to Aaron Shapiro at KCARD, I'm sure she'd be happy to work with you on that. And she also even has an email sign up so you can learn about grants and other opportunities as they occur. Community Farm Alliance within Kentucky, or even our organization, Appalachian Sustainable Development. There's any number of different regional partners that we've worked with, or folks that are doing programming in the agricultural sector that can be good sources of information. So I don't want to present Cooperative Extension or the federal offices as the only sources of information, but I do think they are important sources for the average producer.